London is my all-time favorite city. So when I heard the Aginext being in London, I already anticipated seeing myself at Trafalgar Square, Piccadilly Circus, and that kind of stuff. But it's a virtual conference, so that won't happen today. But what will happen is that we can discuss, of course, interesting topics. And my topic today is about built-in quality. Quality and Agile are interesting topics. They're very much related, because when a user story is finished, we assume that it's of sufficient quality. It's non-negotiable, actually, the quality. We want to have a potential shippable product. So quality is built in. But how do we build quality in? Well, there's a lot of information available about that, but I think it lacks a little bit about information how you implement built-in quality. So today I'd like to share my ideas on that and give you some tips and thoughts and hope to inspire you and look at what an Agile coach can do to contribute to built-in quality. And my story starts with talking about business agility and why built-in quality is important to achieve that, but we won't stay too long talking about the definitions because I want to move on to the implementation of built-in quality. And we'll learn that there's a lot of practices available, but rather than just starting somewhere in an ad hoc manner, we might want to create a situation and a system where we can do validated learning. And I think that helps if we define some built-in quality feedback loops. And we can do a targeted improvement of the quality, and we'll have a look at the Agile coach's role in that. But the story starts with the customer, because the customer is harder to retain, more critical than ever, and very important, of course. So a lot of companies take customer experience very important. And we want to adapt our products and deliver those products and make an impact so we can attain and retain our customers. And in order to do that, we need to stand out, deliver things that are different than our competitors, that are of more value so they stay with us and come towards us. And I think for that, we need some business agility. We need to deliver the right product. So we need to know whether the product that we make is actually what the customer wants. We deliver a good product. So that means the quality. And we need to deliver it fast and frequent, preferably before the competitor does, but in small batches so we can learn from that. So to do that, we need to have feedback. Feedback ultimately from the customer that's playing with our tool, is using our tool, is using our services, is paying for it, and giving us feedback in complaints, positive emotions, information about the usage, anything that helps us to learn what we are doing and whether we make the right product. But there's something funny about obtaining customer feedback, of course, because you need to put it live. You need to put it into production. You need to put it out there so users can experience that. And sometimes that's easy, but not in every organization. I see organizations struggle with that. So I use this picture as a suspension bridge that symbolizes the crossing to production, which might be hard, challenging, leading to deployment errors, leading to a lot of bug fix releases, anything that scares us. So if we do not really trust the product or the release process, and if we are afraid to go into production, the whole idea of early customer feedback is crumbling and our business agility is crumbling, and we don't want that, of course. So we want to trust the quality of the system, the quality of the adaptations that we made, the integrated system and the deployed system, so we dare to go live. And I think built-in quality typically gives us that confidence, that the quality of the solution and the development process is okay. So it's a good idea maybe to talk about built-in quality. I hope I validated that. So what is built-in quality? Well, one important thing is it's not new. It's been there for years. It's originating from Lean. And if you Google it, you find links like this, pictures like this, which are quite randomly. I just picked a few that I liked, which state that you need to solve the root cause of the problems. You need to create transparency. You need to find errors as early as possible. You need to do a lot of unit testing, that kind of stuff. But it doesn't really give you a definition, does it? It's hard to find a definition. I tried to find a few, but I'm not really pleased with that. I found in a site called Alvra, which is actually not an IT site, but a construction site, says built-in quality means we develop the product or service right from the first time. It's good, it's nice, we want that, but is it a definition? I don't think so. Built-in quality aims to reduce the cost of delay and rework. I like that a lot. I think we should do that. Maybe SAFe gives an answer, because SAFe is a skilled agile framework which is quite descriptive, and SAFe says it's a set of practices that ensure that each solution element, at each increment, at each stage of the development cycle is of sufficient quality. Well, that's a good aim to do, I think. Let's invest that a little bit further. So I trust you're aware of the SAFe framework, and this is the big picture of SAFe, which you can find on the internet, and it's a clickable map, and each icon gives you a lot of information. And all the way in the corner is a small icon which represents the built-in quality. So if we click on that, what do we learn? There's a lot of information available, and SAFe describes a lot of practices that you can apply, mostly in the low corner at team level. So what does SAFe say about built-in quality, and what practices does it recommend? Well, one thing it says, start thinking test first. So define your tests first and then build your solution. So you ensure that you have good think about what you want, what the requirements are. You automate your tests up front, so you don't have a delay or a backlog in tests that you still need to do, and your tests are always up to date. And typical practices that go with that is BDD, behavior-driven development, and test-driven development, TDD. They state automate, but automate at the right place. And they show you the testing pyramid, which you might know because it's quite famous, which shows don't make too much tests on GUI or integration level, because those tests are slow, they're brittle, they're hard to maintain. Rather go underneath in the lower layers of the pyramid and do your unit test, because they're the opposite of what I just said. And then they say do a lot of integration and do a lot of testing with integration, set up a continuous integration and deployment pipeline. And if you want to run very frequently, you need to ensure that the test set is not too big, doesn't take too long, doesn't slow you down, slows your cadence down. So evaluate your test set, because test sets tend to grow over time if you keep adding extra tests as you go along. But sometimes maybe you need to remove unnecessary tests or come up with a regression test strategy, which tells you which tests you should be done on check-in, which tests you can do on a nightly build or weekly build, or how you do that. And then last but not least, they say embed quality in every stage of the development cycle. And in addition to the traditional definition of done, SAFe says there's a cascaded definition of done, which you see depicted very small there, which is the first column is about the team, and then in different layers in the continuous integration and in the deployment pipeline, additional checks that you can do. Funny enough, SAFe is really focused on the team level and is depicting what happens after you have coded your stuff, and doesn't really go to the left, where you go to the source and the start of the development cycle. So that might be an omission. But what can we do as Agile coach with this information? I think we can stimulate discussions at team level during retrospectives, during AMM sessions. I did some AMM sessions where we included code quality and the pipeline building as measurement of how mature the team was. We can also include it in sprint planning meeting in order to address that we take enough time to innovate and work on those items. Because it's an important thing, right? The Agile principles state teams should strive for something like technical excellence, and I think embracing these items is part of that. And Agile coaches can help the team to remember that, put it on the agenda, and ensure that there's discussions about how we can improve our way of working and how we can improve the delivery of quality software. And that helps. If you want to know more about that, because I'm not going to talk about all the things that SAFe describes, there's a nice book by Gita, which is all about testing in the Agile SAFe framework. You can check that up. It's free, available on the internet. And I wrote an ebook several years ago with Bertrand Pedersen from Denmark about testing and quality in SAFe and multiple levels in the SAFe framework, and which roles are there and what practices there are. So you might want to learn a little bit about that if you're not familiar with what I was talking about. So we talked about business agility and why that's important and why we want to trust the quality and what built-in quality is. But how do we implement built-in quality? I think there are three things to consider. The first thing is we want to apply it. We want to do those practices like I talked about, and we encourage the team to apply those practices. But it comes with a challenge, because there's a lot of practices out there. I showed you a few. I came up myself with 75 practices that are not all testing practices, but different practices that at different moments in your development cycle can help you to increase the quality and gain that confidence in the quality. So that's a lot. Another challenge is that if you pick one of those things and you start doing that, does that mean that quality is built in? So this typical developer says, I'm doing BDD. Does that mean that I have quality built in? Well, I don't know. I know that if he did that on his own, in his own team, on an island, local optimized, he's not really there yet. So the second thing to consider is whether we have alignment with multiple teams. Because if we're working in multiple teams in delivering one product, we might want to align the quality measures as well. And I see a lot of organizations where different teams have different test tools applied, different processes, but they're not really aligned. So there might be some need in aligning that, and as Agile coaches we can address that, of course, and make that a point to consider. But when we are considering applying those practices and improving the quality, we should think about that there's a lot of challenges that the team have as well. This is not the only thing they were thinking about. And I like to show this slide, which is some summary of challenges that I see in the organizations that I walk around, is that there's a low predictability. So on story level, that's okay, but it's difficult to complete epics, especially if epics are owned by multiple teams. So a lot of organizations and product owners and business managers are mentioning to me, like, I want to have more predictability. I want to have a higher velocity, but preferably a predictability. There's a lot of waterfall in the higher levels of the organizations, and there's sometimes a clash between the agile way of working and the planning and what the organization expects in a more programmed manner. I see a lot of component teams where the teams know a lot about their component and the technology of the system, but there's less awareness of the customer journey. So it's hard to have that end-to-end solution that we had on one of the previous slides. Then there's a lot of trouble with test environments, and there was an assessment done in one of my customers' offices, and they said the number one challenge is we do not have environments that support end-to-end delivery. And in all that, where we try to communicate and collaborate, there's a lot of dependencies that we need to deal with. But there's one item that I didn't mention, and that stands out in the context of this presentation. Teams are very busy, and they have no time to improve, and they have no time to automate, or little time. I see a lot of teams that are really focusing on delivering, business that's urging them on to deliver more and more and more, and sometimes it's hard to actually improve. I spoke with a product owner once that did 90% of issuing and issues solving, was a DevOps team, and change. And when they come up with a good idea, he really liked it and said, yeah, well, we got only 10% of our time left to do all that stuff. So that will take a long time before we actually get any results there. So if we have all those practices that we can apply, but we have little time, which one should we pick? Where should we start? That's a good question. And I think the solution is to start small and create an environment where we can learn and do validated learning experience and grow from that. And the answer could be that we define some feedback loops. We zoom out, look at the whole development cycle, and rather than jumping in some practice because we happen to know that or we have some knowledge or it aligns with our work, we take a step back and think about where does it actually yield most effect and impact if we start improving, and where can we learn about the quality of a development cycle, and where can we learn when there's something wrong with the product. In order to do that, we need to draw up our development cycle, and I made a standard one here which starts with a roadmap where the long-term planning is made, and on that are several releases. So the second step is the release planning, which defines the big chunks of work, epics or features if you like to call them that way. And then they go into refinement, where the features are split into stories, and they're more detailed until they are ready to go into sprint planning and be drawn in the sprint. The next stage is therefore user story realization, unit testing, peer reviewing, that kind of stuff, the technical development work, where we want to test the functionalities that we added, so the functional and non-functional testing of the user stories, and want to integrate the user stories in the increment in order to have a technical release. After that, we have another phase, which is somewhere over here, which might be acceptance and testing the end-to-end customer journey, especially if you have external systems or parties involved in your customer journey. That might be quite a big thing. And then when everything seems to be working, we put it out to production. And we're not done yet in the development cycle, so I added the maintenance and monitoring and production as well, so we can learn how it's being used and detect errors and solve errors. So if we have all these steps, maybe we want to have some feedback loops in that development cycle in order to avoid that we deliver poor software that doesn't work to the end user. So I added a feedback loop in each step, and each feedback loop has a purpose. It has the purpose to detect a flaw, an error, before it's passed on to the next stage and people are working on that. So in the first line where we make the roadmap, we want to find errors before a product is scheduled. In the release planning, we want to have errors detected before we actually start creating user stories. In the refinement, we work on those user stories, and then the next step will be that they're being built in the sprint, but we want to detect errors and avoid that before they're being built, etc., etc., etc. Until in the last stage, of course, we want to avoid errors to be delivered to the client, because we want to do things the first time right, or right the first time, that's better phrased, and that means we need to deliver good quality right the first time to the customer. If we create a feedback loop in each step of the development cycle, we can initiate an interesting discussion at different levels in the organization about what that means and how we detect that and avoid those errors. So typical questions could be, how do we define quality? How do we measure it? When can we detect it? And what do we do when it's sufficient? And maybe we just investigate the development cycle, pick a place where we think make most impact and where the most problems are inserted, and then have this discussion with the people involved. And when that's a higher level, we're talking with higher level people in the organizations. If it's lower, closer to the team, we're talking with team more and more. And what can we do as Agile coach? I think we can moderate this discussion. We can guide the discussion, explain what is needed, and ensure that it's a supple discussion that runs well and yields results. We can provide something like this, like a template, where we say, let's fill this one in. This is the goal. We make some stop the line criteria for this feedback loop. And in this example, I use an epic, and I will use that throughout the presentation because it's a very simple, clear case. The quality definition could be that an epic should be owned, profitable, sized, and an end-to-end solution. And how do we measure that? Well, we use a definition of ready on an epic level. And it says that an epic has a business sponsor, is supported by a business case, and can be done within 3-month period. I like that a lot, to state that. You can discuss whether that's needed, but it helps to keep things small. And when can we detect whether that's the case or not? Well, if a central or chief product owner is doing an intake before the epic is placed on the epic backlog and it does that check, then we have a check moment. Cool. So we're having a discussion and we have some results. Another example could be the roadmap. That was part of the development cycle, and I think a roadmap should be feasible and realistic. And that means that we have taken into account the work in progress limit, so we don't take too many epics simultaneously because we want to have focus on completion. We want to know the dependencies between the teams and the skills that are needed, and maybe there are some fixed deadlines that we need to consider as well, that we cannot move around and we need to give them priority. And when can we detect deviation in the roadmap from quality? Well, during a quality quarterly planning meeting, a PI event, if you do SAFe, or during portfolio meetings. So by doing this, we engage in interesting discussion with different people about the quality. And maybe we wanted to start talking about what happens if the quality is insufficient. And in order to do that, we need to create some stop-the-line criteria. And stop-the-line is typically from Lean as well. Here you see a production line of cars and a guy who's willing to pull the yellow ending cord. And in Lean it says you have your DOKA, and when anyone sees a problem, he can stop the production line, and then everything is stopped. We don't work any further, and we all focus on finding the root cause of the problem. And once we found it, we solve that, and then we start with delivering again. And it has some advantages, because for one thing, we reduce waste. For instance, if the epic is poor, we don't make user stories on that. We don't implement user stories. We don't further process that because, well, the core is not good. We avoid that other products roll off the line. So maybe if there's something wrong with the epic, there might be something wrong with the other epics as well. So we avoid that those streams are continuing and delivering flaws or errors. And I think very much, I like this one, we ensure that the root cause is eliminated. Because very often I see that further up in the development stream, teams start to compensate for problems that are starting somewhere else. So they have local optimization and they're compensating for that. And if you're new in an organization, you're triggered by that. But if you're long in an organization, you learn to work around the problems and you find your solutions. So stop the line might help to do that. But how many organizations actually have those discussions about what do we do when it's wrong? Well, if you have that, you might add extra stuff to the template. For instance, in the epic example, when the epic is insufficient, we reject it. What do? The CPO sits with business sponsors to assess the impact, and maybe we draft a new roadmap. And we need the business stakeholder and the CPU to be there. And in the roadmap, when the WIP limit is exceeded or we see some dependencies, we refactor the roadmap. And these are the people that should be involved. It could be interesting to have that discussion. The third thing to consider is the measuring time, the time that it takes to get the quality assessment. Because if you take that too long and it's too much labor to do, it won't work. It will stop the cadence, it will slow things down, or will just take too much effort. So we need to continue the discussion and start talking about what's an acceptable feedback time. How much time are we allowing ourselves to detect that something is wrong? And if you look at the internet, you see pictures like this, which is on coding based, so it's from the team again onwards, and it tells you that you want to have in minutes feedback when something is wrong with the code, and maybe something later like weeks for the UAT. But it's not on the start, on the shift left items available. So I just made this table and I say, well, when there's something wrong and the customer is affected, you want to know that in less than a day, maybe in seconds, depending on your business. When a user story is done, you want to know it in one day. You want to know it before the sprint is done. You want to know within the sprint, that kind of thing. So that gives some idea about the activities that you want to do in that area. And maybe if a release schedule, which is more than a year ahead, 4 weeks of feedback time is acceptable. Maybe less, but it's up to you to decide that in your organization. And maybe there's a small tip to there, start with the lightweight check. Don't make it too heavy, but just make it simple so it's easy to assess and start using that, because we will see that you can learn and adapt. So in order to get grip on that feedback, we check where we want to start and just pick one of those feedback loops and start measuring. We have an intelligent discussion and agree what quality is and how we detect whether it's too low, and discuss what we'll do in that case. And we start thinking about the feedback loop and how critical that check can be in that time. And then we have the fourth item, which I didn't explain yet, which is really important, and that's the root cause analysis that we want to do in order to have continuous improvement. So if we have installed that feedback loop, then two things can happen, right? It never occurs that we have to stop the line because everything is fine. All those epics in my example are just fine. Or we have to stop it more than once, all the time, a lot, and we want to do something. Well, in case if we don't have to stop the line, everything is great, so congratulations. Maybe just move on to another feedback loop, create a second feedback loop, a third feedback loop, and start measuring there. But before you do that, you might want to assess whether there are problems further up in the line, and if that's the case, or whether the performance of the product is too poor, you might want to tighten the criteria a bit. If you have to stop the line several times, that's also great, because you got a learning opportunity. So the first thing is to check the root cause and to validate whether it's false alarm. If it's false alarm because there's basically nothing wrong, then your criteria are too strict and you have to relax them. But if it's not false alarm, this is where the real improvements start. And I think you want to correct the product. So if there's something wrong in the product and you detect that, correct it so you can continue with that. But you also want to improve the process and avoid that from happening. So you want to adapt the process or maybe train the people. And if you do that, you start to improve the quality. You create some kind of mixing desk where you can fade in and fade out improvements, and you're in control of that because you created a learning method where you install feedback loop, see what happens, install another feedback loop, improve the process, the people and the products, and that way we can start improving the quality. And I think Agile coaches can play a good role in that, because we can help with changing the process. We're very good in change processes. We can help in training the people or facilitate the training of the people. We can help in prioritizing those quality measures, those 75 that we had, and we maybe can define some experiments within the teams or tribe level or department level on how we can use those principles or practices in order to get, or how do you say that? Conduct experiments and learn from that and continue further or adapt the improvement process. So we can help with prioritizing those issues, can we not? Because there were a lot of practices, they were all nice, and where the developer probably takes some development items and the tester takes some test practices, business might take some business practices, we can take a step back as Agile coach and facilitate which practices might yield the most results. And in order to help you with that, I sorted those practices for each step in the development life cycle, so we get a little bit more information, like if we want to pinpoint and learn that we want to improve in a certain stage of the software development life cycle, we no longer have 75 practices, but we have a limited set of practices. I can make it slightly more interesting maybe, because I'm developing a three-wave of Agile model where I state that organizations go to different phases in their Agile journey. And the focus first is on one team, secondly it's on team cross-team alignment, and the third phase is where we really go for business value end-to-end, and we have more focus on leadership than on teams. I'm not going to explain the whole three-wave models, but if we look at this, we know that the organization is struggling with different things in the start of their Agile journey than as they are struggling with or engaging with when they're further up ahead in the Agile journey. Likewise, some practices might fit better if you start with your Agile journey, and some practices might fit better if you're further on in the Agile journey. So if we color code that, we get this picture, where the orange ones are the ones that you can start off in the beginning of your Agile journey, and then if it moves on. So we can help by having this discussion and suggesting some practices and check whether these practices are in place. But we do that for one of the feedback loops and move on to another feedback loop and another feedback loop as well. And while we do that, we learn and we also improve things. And I think if we start doing that, we increase the predictability of our software development lifecycle. We reduce a lot of waste because we don't work anymore on ill products, especially if we move up and shift left and detect errors earlier. We improve the quality of the system and we shorten the time to market. So that's great because those were all the things that we need to have in order to have business agility. But further on, I think we create leverage for further improvements. because we free time, so we have more time to work on those items, but also because we create success, and with our target approach we can tell a story and we get more commitment to spend time on those improvements because people believe they work. So as a wrap-up, I started with business agility and said that we want to adapt and deliver and get a feedback loop from the client. But in order to do that, we need to trust the system and go live with that as frequently as possible. So we need to have built-in quality. And we looked at some definitions of built-in quality, and we deep dived the SAFe framework with that little icon in the corner at team level and described some of those practices and principles that SAFe is prescribing. I showed you some ebooks that you can read if you want to learn more, and we have a lot of practices available, and if you apply that, 3 rules apply. First, do it, align it, so don't do a single team, but do it in a multiple team fashion, and then spend your time wisely because a lot of teams have little time to improve. So select where you want to start. And in order to do that, we zoomed out and created some feedback loops. And for each feedback loop, we started measuring, do some RCA, and from that we learn and do targeted improvements. And I showed you the sorting of a lot of practices to watch the place in the software development lifecycle, so you can adapt that to your own situation and suggest improvements and practices in a more targeted way. And that way we end up with more business agility, faster feedback loops, and delivering more quality goods. I shared some ideas of what Agile coaches can do throughout the presentation, and I think we can start a discussion about technical excellence in the teams, talk about that during retrospectives, AMM, sprint planning, explain that it's important, explain why it's important, and try to gain commitment for spending time on improvements. We can guide the assessment of the software development lifecycle, do some value stream mapping, make sessions with the stakeholders to discuss what actually the steps are and where the waste and the problems are. We can have discussions about stop the line criteria for each feedback loop, and we can moderate that and facilitate that and put it on the agenda, bring in the template if you want, create the stop the line criteria, but also initiate some root cause analysis and get those people together in order to learn whether they actually want to tighten or relax the criteria and whether they want to improve. And we can help with prioritizing the practices and defining experiments in order to improve the software development lifecycle. So there's a lot that we can do. And the question might be, what do you need to know from testing and those things as Agile coach? I think it's good if you learn those practices and they have some meaning for you, but depending how deep and technical you will be, some coaches are really team coaches and go sit with the team and build a pipeline. Some Agile coaches are more generic, but you can learn from the practices and have a discussion about that and initiate that contact and topic. And if you do that, you create quality awareness throughout the organization and different levels of the organization. And that's worthwhile, I think. You eliminate waste, you create more confidence, and you contribute to that in the quality of the system and the process that we need to go live. And that's, I think, where Agile and Agile coaches come in very good. We created validated learning where we can learn where improvements yield the most impact and adapt our approach, some inspect and learning things. And that way we have a targeted usage of quality measures that can really help us to deliver value in a good fashion and achieve those customer satisfaction and positive feedback.